Welcome to part 2 of the Chapter 2 lecture video on job performance. In this video, we will discuss several different methods of rating employee performance. When thinking of performance management, there are several approaches to evaluating employee performance, and these include the comparative approach, the attribute approach, behavioral approaches, and results-based approaches. Comparative approaches make evaluations by making comparisons between different employees. These comparisons can include ranking or paired comparison. With ranking, we can use simple ranking, which simply involves ranking employees from highest to lowest, with the highest performers at the tippy top of the list and then the lowest at the very bottom. We could also use alternative ranking, where you cross names off in a high-low, high-low, high-low fashion. And this is very similar to how we determine median values. So you would cross off the highest performer, then the lowest performer, then you would cross off the second highest performer, and then the second lowest performer, and so on. And you would continue the process until you got to the middle person, and this person would reflect your average employee. You could also use a forced distribution where you rank everyone in groups. For example, you've got an above average group, an average group, and then a below average group. If you didn't want to use a ranking comparative approach, the alternative is to use a paired comparison, which compares each employee to every other employee. Now, this takes a bit longer because you're comparing each employee to every other possible combinations of employees, but it is quite effective. So it would compare, for example, Joe to Sam, then it would compare Joe to Bob, and then it would compare Joe to Emily, and then it would also compare Sam to Bob, Sam to Emily, and Bob to Emily, and everybody else in your company. So you're creating these forced dyads, and dyad is two people, where you're comparing two people at every single time. Now, rather than using comparative approaches, another option is to use an attribute approach. And with attribute approaches, you would evaluate employees based on important job-related attributes, characteristics, or traits. So again, it's in the name, it's an attribute approach. So you're focusing on attributes and traits themselves. For example, you can rate an employee's initiative, their leadership capabilities, their conscientiousness, their competitiveness, their grittiness, whatever it may be. And attribute techniques include graphic rating scales, where you list the desirable traits on a Likert type rating scale. And with this approach, only one employee is considered at a time. So as you will notice with this example of a graphic rating scale, on the left, there's a list of desirable traits or characteristics, knowledge, teamwork, communication, etc. And then at the top, there are levels ranging from poor to distinguished. And these aren't the only levels you could use, but they are intuitive for our example. In this example, once you've determined your desirable traits and the levels you want to rate those traits on, you would rate each employee across each predetermined trait. For example, for knowledge, I would think about a specific employee and then I would determine whether their knowledge is distinguished, excellent, average, adequate, or poor. And then I would circle or highlight the appropriate value. And then I would do the same thing for teamwork and communication and creativity and initiative and resilience. And I would just continue to work my way down the list. And then I would repeat this process for employee 2 and for employee 3 and so on. Now, another attribute option is using mixed standard scales, which list statements representing good, average, and poor performance along different performance dimensions. And again, only one employee is considered at a time here. As an example, you can see that the manager or HR professional here has identified specific statements reflecting high, medium, and low levels of certain traits like leadership and initiative. The rater would then provide a plus sign, a minus sign, or a 0 next to each predetermined statement. So you would read each statement and decide if the performance on that trait was above what was described in the statement, then you would give it a plus. If performance was equal to what was described in the statement, you would give it a 0. And if performance was below what was described in the statement, then you would give it a minus. Another alternative to comparative or attribute-based approaches are behavioral approaches of PM. And these include an evaluation based on important job-related behaviors. So we're focusing on behaviors. One way to assess behavior is using a BAR, or a behaviorally anchored rating scale, which defines performance dimensions by developing behavioral anchors associated with different levels of performance. And what's important here is the bar scales capture types of behavior. I want to highlight this again. They're capturing types of behavior. And the distinction between types and frequency is important for understanding the difference between bars versus a BOS scale. So hopefully with the examples that will become clearer. So with the bars, the HR professional or the manager would identify activities reflecting different levels of a specific task. In this case, preparedness. Less appealing behaviors of preparedness would be reflected on the bottom of the list, and then more favorable behaviors would be listed at the top. And these activities are ordered such that each activity above the ladder is more favorable. So as you move up the hierarchy or move up the ladder, the behaviors are becoming more and more favorable. Another behavioral approach is a behavioral observation scale, or a BOS, which defines all the behaviors that are necessary for effective or ineffective performance. And whereas a bars capture types of behavior, a BOS captures the frequency of that behavior. So in the example here, each behavior is ranked on a frequency scale ranging from never to always. So once you've rated each behavior, you would tally up the total to get an overall performance rating. So I would read each item, decide how often that employee engages in that specific behavior, and then I would tally up the total number of points to get an overall score. And again, the BOS is focusing on frequency versus the bars, which focuses on the actual type of behavior. The last common type of PM is a results-based approach, which evaluates employees on measurable results based on specific goals. The focus of results-based PM is an objective, measurable, and quantitative results system. And a great example of results approaches is the management by objectives approach, which involves a comparison of met and unmet goals and objectives based on the standards originally agreed upon. So with a MBO, supervisors and subordinates sit down ahead of time and they agree on a list of targeted goals. For example, having a sales revenue of $100,000 in the course of 1 year. At the end of the targeted time frame, the dyad would then sit down again and determine the extent to which the goals were accomplished. So in the example on the slide, if the objective was to generate $100,000 over the next 12 months, and the person actually generated $150,000, then they would have had 150% complete. So it gives you a quantifiable idea of how much of that goal was met. Alternatively, in the other example of portfolio management, if the person only increased their portfolio by 18 rather than 20%, then they would only have completed 90% of their goal. Now, understanding employee performance and its antecedents or predictors is a critical issue for organizations. Although some jobs assess job performance based solely on objective outcomes like the number of cars sold or total profits, job performance is so much more than that. And as your textbook highlights, there are significant issues with assessing job performance using only results-based metrics or indicators. For starters, outcome-based measures disregard external factors beyond the employee's control, like the quality of the products or the services sold, or the quality of the equipment used. It also doesn't account for how competitive the market is or what the environmental conditions are like. For example, whether there is a global pandemic or a national recession happening. Results-based metrics also don't account for social aspects of the work environment like politics or social support, so that is also problematic. Furthermore, focusing on only bottom line results can lead to what is known as a bottom line mentality, which often manifests in social undermining behavior and unethical behavior in the workplace. The Wells Fargo scandal is a great illustration of what can happen when organizations focus on the bottom line above all else. So in 2016, Wells Fargo was accused of opening millions of unauthorized accounts and engaging in other unethical practices. The heart of the issue stemmed from an incentive program based almost entirely on product sales goals and sales metrics. In some cases, employees engage in their fraudulent behavior willingly, and in other cases, they were asked to do so by their supervisors in order to keep the local branch's sales quotas within the acceptable range. So this is an example of one of the issues with a bottom line mentality, which is that if all you care about is profits, you're more likely to engage in some of those unethical behaviors because it's the only way you can survive in an overly competitive environment. And lastly, beyond the disregard for external factors and the issues of bottom line mentality, results-based metrics often don't account for extra role behaviors or all the positive behaviors employees engage in beyond those formally required by the job. And in general, there are 5 sources of PM information, which include managers, peers and coworkers, subordinates, self-ratings, and customers or clients. And when rating other people or ourselves, there are several types of rater errors worth discussing. The first is the similar to me effect, which occurs when people assume that others behave in a comparable manner as themselves. So, for example, assuming others are extroverted and friendly because you're extroverted and friendly. Another bias is the contrast effect, which arises when you compare someone to others. So, if I present a paper and do terribly, I am now the standard for comparison for everybody else. So, this is just whenever you compare and contrast two people. Sometimes it happens subconsciously, and sometimes it's very intentional. But those comparisons can bias your rankings of other people in the future. Now, there are also what are known as distributional errors, and these include things like a leniency error, which is when you provide leniency for everyone. So, an example of this would be giving everyone a high score when competing in evaluation. So, everyone gets a 5 out of 5. Another distributional error is central tendency, which arises when you give everyone a moderate or average rating, so giving everyone like a 3 out of a 5. And then a strictness tendency arises when everyone receives very severe ratings, so giving everyone a 1 out of a 5. A halo effect occurs when you focus on one favorable characteristic or attribute of a person and then view that person more positively in all other aspects of their ratings. So, for example, rating someone very high on all factors just because they're attractive. So, that attractiveness has created a halo and it's blurred your judgment in all other areas. Conversely, the horns effect occurs when you focus on one negative characteristic or attribute and then rate a person more unfavorably in all other factors because of that one factor. So, for example, rating someone very low on all factors because you think they're arrogant. Now, once you have determined the level of an employee's performance, hopefully while avoiding falling victim to some of those biases we discussed, there are specific requirements for effective performance feedback. Number one, you want to be sure to give very specific and detailed feedback. And the more specific, the better, as employees then know exactly what they need to do to work on and their true areas of concern. Number two, you want to encourage employee participation in the performance feedback process. So provide opportunities for questions and concerns. And you want to allow employees to provide feedback on your feedback. So this should be a conversation back and forth. Number three, you want to focus feedback on actual behaviors, not on the person. So if an employee has a tendency to be rude to customers, reference the instances of rudeness rather than stating the employee is rude. This is like therapy 101. You focus on the problem, not the person. Highlight the specific problematic behaviors. Number four, you want to recognize and describe what effective performance looks like. So you have a real clear picture and explicit behavioral description, and you provide really good examples of what appropriate or effective behavior would look like. And then number five, you want to focus on how to solve problems or issues while minimizing criticism. And the minimizing criticism aspect is important. Unless the poor performance is reoccurring constantly, or it's grounds for termination, then it's important that you provide your performance feedback in a very developmental and helpful way. And performance feedback shouldn't be an argument, but instead should be a two-way conversation. Thus, how you present that feedback and the tone of the conversation is important because people will shut down when they're exposed to a lot of criticism. Too much criticism can make people's blinders come up. They shut down. They're not taking in information. It becomes an attack and a threat on themselves, and they're not going to change. So you got to do it in a developmental and behavioral focused way. And last, number six, you want to set very specific goals and timelines for achieving those goals. As you may notice, specificity is very important. You have to provide specific details. You have to provide specific goals. You need to talk about specific behaviors. So specificity is important. And we'll talk about this later when we talk about motivation, but specificity is a key element in motivating other people, ensuring that goals and standards are met over time. My cat is rubbing my mic, so I do apologize if you can hear him. Okay, that is it for this chapter. If you have any questions, please email me on Canvas or directly at samantha.jordan@unt.edu.